I'm Kat Jurick, and I'm going to talk today a little bit from the user experience perspective about building for an end user and bringing some kind of traditional or classic user experience and then also usability issues, or they're not issues, I guess they're known things that you can bring in to help you as you're thinking about designing and developing today and beyond. So a little bit about me, I've been in and around the field of user experience for probably over 10 years now. I've worked with both hardware and software. My background originally from a school perspective was industrial design, so I kind of have this in my blood and am really excited to figure out where research is going to go into virtual reality and how we can take some of the things that we already know and apply them, and then also just discover absolutely new things, because not everything that works in a traditional format is going to continue to work in these formats as we are working with users in completely immersive experiences that we haven't seen yet. So I think that's super exciting and fun. So a common thing that you hear a lot in user experience, you hear a lot of user experience designers, developers, researchers talking to each other about how you're not really your end users. A lot of times you're having this fight with other stakeholders, and those stakeholders are the people that have the money. Because they say, oh, well, I can do this in Facebook, so why can't I do it in X or Y, or why can't we just be the Uber for whatever and have that solve all our problems? That's not actually true. So some things to think about as you're getting started. And my goal with this was to set this up so that it could stand alone by itself, so you could think a little bit about it now if you're trying or struggling with how to get started, and if you are starting to develop something or an idea and you want to take it further, these things might help you come back to you a little bit later to think about. So the first thing, of course, is who's going to be using the thing that you're building. And it's a key conversation to have early and often with your teammates. I've seen this over and over again where people tend to use the same words but mean different things. So depending what your background is, depending on what kind of experience you already have, you bring that with you. And if you don't kind of lay it all on the table or put it up on the walls, when you first start working together as a team, there might be confusion that comes later, just as part of a language barrier, as it were. So things to talk about, of course, hardware, the environment that you expect people will be in, whether or not they're expert or novice. Are people bringing preconceived notions? Are you designing for somebody who has a particular knowledge set already, right? If you're building a bowling alley, do you expect that people coming into this bowling alley already know how to bowl or have been bowling in real life? And then what's that going to do for the experience that you're creating for them, or how you help them understand what to do in the experience that you're building? Things like height, reach, some of the physical constraints. It's more than okay to make assumptions or to create your own rules. We've talked a lot about different kinds of rule sets today. And what's great about that is that you can set all that up and then you can come back to it and test later. So just write them down or be conscious of the fact that you are kind of making some of those parameters for yourself, regardless of whether or not they are things that are known things or maybe new worlds entirely. We saw the wireframe example during the first talk today, which was pretty amazing. So think about, again, what people already know. So somebody who's over 30 knows what this device is and knows how to use it and can probably operate it pretty well. Somebody under 10 is going to have a hard time with it, and they're going to get really frustrated trying to operate it, and they're probably going to fail, actually. So as you're starting to thinking about using common actors in the way that people are interacting with your tools and the things that you're building, start to think about that in terms of what people bring to the table, what they already know. And then when it comes to learning, how do you build the learning experience in? As part of the user's experience, right? Nobody's going to read the manual. They've got a headset on. They don't care. They just want to get going. So how are you able to bring some of those things in to the experience that you have? So in traditional web user experience, it's called onboarding. In gaming, it's often called scaffolding. So this is the idea that things exist when you need them, or they appear when you need them. So storytelling in terms of initially like arriving in this experience and having a short movie that tells you sort of who you are, where you are, what you should be attempting to do. How-to tutorials, rules and constraints, we've talked about that. Just-in-time information. If I always have the map available, when I get to the point where I really need to look at the map, I may not realize that that's the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. So as helpers or other bits of information that somebody needs in order to be successful is appearing as they need it and not sort of there all the time in their way. The idea of leveling up. So if somebody is a novice, that they have experiences early on that let them be really successful, and they base the learning that they're getting from that success to as things get more complicated or more complex later on. In a perfect world, somebody who already knows these things can skip over and it's not in their way, which is sort of where that scaffolding framing comes from. So if I'm an expert, I can just start in at level 30. I don't need anybody to hold my hand. I don't need anybody to teach me. I don't want to be bothered with that stuff. And so thinking about what stage your audience is in, if you're designing for only experts, that's great too. If you're designing for people who aren't necessarily going to know, then it's something to think about. So a couple of concepts. If you are just starting out, especially I know there's a team that is all designers that didn't have developers working with them today, so this is another kind of great place to get started, is to think about scenarios. I typically do these as a post-it exercise or even just a writing exercise. You can do it by yourself or you can do it as a team. Just start thinking about these little short stories, maybe no longer than a paragraph. Who is the user? What is the user's goals? What are the tools that the user needs to accomplish those goals? And then what are the tasks that each person must do to accomplish those things? And if you have different kinds of user types, so different actors, people who are representational of different roles, then you are going to want to write a scenario, even if it's the same action, for each of those different actors, because it's going to be a different experience for them. And then over time, all the scenarios fit together and you end up with an experience. What's great about this is that a user may have a great time only doing 3 of those things. They may come out of it having had a sense of having had a complete experience in whatever this thing is that you're building. People who are more expert or more invested or have spent more time may have the opportunity to uncover more things or to kind of string those things together. And maybe some of it is revealed over time, and then when you can step back and sort of look at that universe, that's where this comes into play. What's great about scenarios is that as you start to validate, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but as you're wanting to test your ideas, you can take those individual scenarios and those tasks that you've already worked out, and then go ahead and put those things in front of people and ask them to play that role and do those tasks and see how successful they are. So user journeys is kind of the complete opposite end of that spectrum, right? So you have all of these little scenarios, those scenarios string together, and you have a story, and then even bigger than that is the idea of the user journey. And I have a couple of examples. This one I don't expect you really to be able to read, but this is the idea of somebody deciding to go and get a cup of coffee at Starbucks, right? So they're in the office, they decide to get in the car, they walk into Starbucks, they stand in line, they order, they pay, they sit down, they drink their coffee, they work in the Starbucks for a little while, then they pack up, they walk out, and they go back to their car. And when you think about it, this sort of makes sense in terms of this is how you go and get a cup of coffee and do some work at Starbucks. But if you're Starbucks and you're thinking about the user's experience, you're probably only thinking about what happens when somebody is physically inside that space. But there's all kinds of other things that can be brought in from the beginning and the end. So as you're thinking about this and you're building immersive worlds, if this is your immersive world, thinking about what's happening before somebody arrives at that state, and then what they take away with them, or how they exit that process, and what they take away, sort of how they feel about it. This can be anything from, actually I'm gonna skip over, motivations, actions, interactions, their emotional states. So it's totally possible that somebody's going to have different emotional states depending on what it is that they're doing. Do you want to leave them with a positive feeling? Do you want to leave them feeling intrigued? Are they having an experience where they feel scared? all of those come into play when you're kind of thinking about what that whole experience is going to be like for them. Breakpoints and failures is another thing to think about. Like, sometimes it's technical failures, but sometimes it's just what doesn't make sense to somebody, or what's standing in the way of their being able to be successful. So in the case of that map, if they can't find the map, then they don't necessarily know what to do next. They're going to feel intimidated. They might feel like they're doing something wrong. And in reality, it's just because they can't connect the dots in terms of the story that is being told. So validations is just a quick plug for user research and usability testing. You always want to be testing early and often. There's a lot of standard, there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of websites out there already about how to do straight up usability testing, but some of the things that are important, I think, to take away is that the sooner you get these concepts, and you can even take those written scenarios or those post-its on the walls, put them in front of people, have them walk through it, give you feedback. The sooner you find out what isn't making sense or where there are issues, the less time you're going to spend coding or creating an experience that somebody is, that you're then maybe necessarily going to have to undo. Though there's learning in that process, which is not a bad thing. So just from a super simple perspective, take the tasks from your user scenarios, give them to somebody, have them narrate out loud what they're doing, see how far that they can get by themselves without help. One of the interesting challenges about testing in VR is that the person is in an immersed space, so you can't interact with them the way that you could if you were typically in a usability lab or in one of those kinds of scenarios. And so thinking about how you get feedback from them while something's happening versus afterwards, because sometimes they won't necessarily remember in the moment. And then ask them. One of my favorite techniques is always to ask people the questions I think I already know the answer to. So ask them to describe the experience they just had and see what they say, and see if that meets your expectations in terms of what they thought that they might be trying to accomplish. In the beginning, user sessions, like you can do them today, right? We have a whole ton of people here who haven't seen your thing yet, so you can put people in front of them really easily. These can be casual, they can be quick, they can be a number of different scenarios tied together. As you start to refine your scenarios, you want to be a little bit more consistent about when and how you get feedback. So if you expect that people are doing these things sitting down, then you should be testing with users that are sitting down. If their home environment or work environment is somewhere where you think that they're going to be using it or experiencing, then you want to be testing in those sorts of environment, and you want to be having people do the same thing, because otherwise you can't necessarily compare one person's experience to another to help you figure out where things are going well and where things can be improved. Try not to repeat people through your system too early. It's amazing how quickly people become experts, so once they're kind of used to the idea, sometimes that's great for getting deeper feedback, but oftentimes if you really want a first-timer's experience, then continue to use first-timers, because you're not going to have that experience otherwise. If you're recording sessions, get written permissions, just a little minute about ethics. If you're building for kids or special populations, make sure that you're adhering to having a parent present, those kinds of things. Just guidelines to think about. And then as you're watching somebody interact with your work, make note of the differences between somebody's opinion, a technology issue, and a story issue or a design issue. Those are three separate things. Sometimes it might be all of those things together. Sometimes you may not be able to figure out which it is, but the closer attention that you're paying, the better off you're going to be in terms of understanding where to start digging when you're making changes. Facial expressions and body language while they're doing tasks. We've seen a lot of videos of people doing VR experiences today. We've seen some that were pretty scary. We've also seen others that are funny, maybe, just to pay attention to, if you can't see somebody's facial expressions necessarily by watching their eyes, which is how we often as humans interpret a lot of what is going on with the person that we're observing, you need to take those other cues. So if somebody's doing this, what does that tell you, and how can you take away from that? Maybe you want them to be doing this. That's okay too. Some users will have more trouble than others, so one person having a problem isn't necessarily indicative of a larger problem to fix. So again, the more often that you're putting people in front of things, the faster you're going to learn. Try to keep opinions out of it. It's really hard to take it not to take it personally when somebody's like, "Oh, this thing is really frustrating." But again, if you're testing a lot and frequently, then you're going to be in really good shape. I always thank the people who are the meanest. Thank you so much for your feedback. It's important feedback too. The ability to accomplish a task is very different from whether or not they like doing something. So again, that opinion comes back into play. You may not necessarily care what they think of it if you want to know whether or not they can get from point A to point B, or they understand what their goals are. And then finally, in the beginning, all ideas are perfect, right? We're at this Create-athon today. Everybody's coming with new ideas. We're all starting from somewhere. And that's a great thing. It means that there are huge worlds that we can be building and exploring. And don't let any of the things that I've just said stop you or constrain you. The best thing to do is just to sort of get started and see where it goes. You can create your own rules, and then the important part is just to sort of bring that validation back in and make sure that you are on the right track in terms of what you're intending your users to experience versus the experience that they're actually having. Thanks.
Woo!
Questions? Hi.
Hi. How has it been different moving from traditional, like designing for traditional UX to here in terms of prototyping? Like when you're early on, and you don't want to like have to do it in Unity or whatever.
Right, yeah, and so that's one of those challenges where like you can take, my thing is always, as a researcher, has always been like, I can test anything. Like I can test a drawing on a napkin and tell you whether or not it's valid. And so taking some of those things where they are really early concepts, we had a team here today that was doing paper prototyping. Those things are just as valuable and may help you hone in on some of the things that you can then decide what you want to put time into in terms of development. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, so you kind of use the same methods.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. There are a lot of similar methods. I think what we think of as traditional usability lab testing isn't necessarily going to work with these experiences. I think for me, for two reasons. One, because it's an immersive experience, you can't interact with somebody without interrupting them while they're in it. And so as we move forward, figuring out how to do that right is going to take some time, I think, and it's anybody's world to kind of figure that out. The second thing is that somebody having an experience, and this is always true, but I think even more so for this, somebody having an experience in a 300 square foot apartment, or when they're lying down on their couch, or sitting down at their desk in an office, is really going to have a lot of influence on the kind of experience that they have in an immersive environment. And so getting to them, going out to where people are, using the tools that they have, if they have an old crummy computer, or if they have a cat that keeps tripping over the wires or chewing on something, like all of those are going to contribute to the experience that you can't control, but you won't know about unless you kind of see it. Any other questions? Yes?
So in the testing process you were describing earlier, how do you prevent biasing your testers? Or how do you prevent your testers from biasing each other? Is there any tips?
How do you mean?
So like, I remember talking to a client of mine, and I was telling him about how the game industry uses testing. Like they'll bring in a whole bunch of people to test the
Play
product.
testing.
Yeah,
Okay.
play testing, exactly. And I was telling him about this, and he's like, "Well, in my experience, that leads to there's a lot of bias." And I didn't have a reply to it. I didn't know what to say.
Playtesting and focus groups, you often run into the same sorts of issues because you have multiple people. And if you've got one alpha voice in the room, there tend to be a lot of people that pile on or then become afraid to give their opinions if they don't match the person who's louder. So if you are going to do that kind of testing, maybe you're figuring out time on task for how fast somebody should be able to get through a process. Or maybe you just are wanting to bang out a whole bunch of time to make sure that people are able to accomplish the goals that you've set up for them. That would be a little bit different than the kind of one-on-one testing that you would be having where you're getting more of that individual feedback. Thank you.